Good morning. Seems like every time I walk out the door, when I come back, there's one more person in the room. If I did that 5 or 6 more times, this we could make the class grow.
Bless you.
I'm gonna pick that clock down because it doesn't represent the truth in terms of times. I have to use this. Anybody happen to open up their notes and readings and see the little thing I stuck in there called getting ready for the exam? I don't know about you guys out there. Some people went into shock when they saw the list of keywords. You have to look at those lists and realize that I'm not going to ask you to list all the members of the tutor family or any of that sort of thing. I put that in there for your background, maybe to help you remember the main parts. And there's some explanations and things like that that make the list grow. If I took all that out, the list wouldn't be very long. But it might lull you to sleep without the explanations in it. Nevertheless, that list is what you should focus on when you're getting ready for the exam. And I've had some panicky notes from students already. I don't know if my notes are enough for the exam. Well, I'll tell you a couple of things. One is, I learned, being a left-handed person, and generally speaking, left-handed people write slower than right-handed people do. I could never keep up with notes in class. So I started writing one word. If something was of interest that I thought I had to remember, I'd write that one word. I didn't try and make it look neat or anything. I just wrote that one word down. And I found out that if I could go back and look at those words and figure out why the heck I'd written them down, I had just studied and I would probably remember it. So, if you go through those keywords and you find major terms that you have no notion about and you can't find anything about them, send me a message and I'll answer your question for everybody. On the other hand, study the high points, study the important things. There's a lot of details that we're throwing at you right now, that I'm throwing at you right now, as we work our way into the American Revolution and get into the Revolution itself. Things like the proclamation line of 1763, writs of assistance, admiralty courts, things like that. Those are all, it's kind of a big long list of things that aggravate either the members of the colony or later on sometimes aggravate the English. And this builds up in tempo. It's kind of like music that starts picking up speed as it goes along as we work our way toward the American Revolution. Colonial reaction to the Townsend Acts. For example, John Dickinson's Letters of a Farmer of Pennsylvania. He's a moderate, and yet he's starting to write a complaint. You see that the Americans are getting more and more involved. General Gage moving soldiers into Boston. He didn't just move them in because he liked the company. He moved them in because you can read this between the lines, because people were being unruly in Boston, and he was concerned about public order. He made some very insensitive mistakes when he did it. He brought in a unit that wasn't particularly well disciplined. That irritated the people of Boston even more. But he got irritated because the people of Boston were misbehaving. And they were. The rabble-rousers, the people that usually come out in front before the more moderate of us kind of follow along behind sometime later, they were causing trouble. John Hancock's affair, where he got caught smuggling, his ship did, the Liberty affair. Virginia sending out even more resolutions about not liking the situation, the taxes. The Boston Massacre, blown into a giant event. It was a pretty big event, but it wasn't a massive massacre. The fact that the British backed down again on the Townsend Act, the Gaspé, the British customs cutter being burned, committees of correspondence being suggested by Virginia. We got down, and I think last time we were talking about, and I'm not putting up any, you notice I don't have any visuals up, and I probably won't put them up, because I want you not to look at pictures, I want you to listen a little bit. Lord North's Tea Act, what's this all about? Lord North was the Prime Minister of England all the way through the American Revolution. We've gone through a whole bunch of Prime Ministers over in England, now it's gonna stop. Nobody wants to be Prime Minister, to tell you the truth. The East India Tea Company, the British East India Tea Company, is going broke. They were probably the most important single commercial entity that England had, bringing income to England. So it's very important for them to save the tea company. And as a result of that, Lord North is going to try and ease the debts of the East India Tea Company by reducing the taxes that they have to pay, allowing them to ship directly to the colonies without having their shipments go through England, the way the Navigation Acts required. And he gave them the sole right to sell their product in the American colonies. This, of course, upset John Hancock and friends, who were being cut out of the business. And I think probably that what they were worried about wasn't so much tea, but they were worried about if it's tea this week, maybe they'll do it with sugar next week, and maybe they'll do it with other things later. So they were very, very concerned. They were wealthy, pretty prosperous people. But now, ever since that Stamp Act, the common man is paying more and more attention to this. That was the big mistake of the Stamp Act. The wrong lesson that the British taught the colonies about making noise, getting the British government to back down. The governor of Massachusetts, the royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, was pressured by the British government. He had recommended against most of the things that they'd done so far. They didn't listen to him. He was their man on the ground, and they failed to listen to him. And now he's in an enviable position of having to enforce this Tea Act, having to figure out a way to solve the fact that the colonists refused to even let the tea land, so they wouldn't have to pay the taxes. And he's going to tell them, if you don't allow it to land, we will use British military and we'll land it for you, and you'll still have to pay the tax on it. At which time, some of the colonists, once again, the bulk of the colonists aren't really thinking about anything like taking action, but the more politically active are. And on the 16th of December, there's going to be an action at night in which the colonists throw at least hundreds of thousands of dollars worth, maybe millions of dollars in the modern day, if you translate the money into modern times, of tea into Boston Harbor. They threw so much into Boston Harbor that people used to joke that you couldn't fish around there because your fish all tasted like tea. The British government, they do this in December. The British government's going to be slow to react. The reaction won't happen until the following year, in 1774, when they passed in Parliament what they called a Coercive Act. These acts were aimed at forcing the colonists to back down. The first one was the Boston Port Act, and basically it said, you're out of business, your port is closed, which was, of course, the lifeblood of Boston. Your port is closed until you pay for that tea. And of course, the colonists weren't planning to do that. They also passed a law that said you can't put English officials on trial in America anymore. They have to go back to England for trial. They also shut down Massachusetts government, the same way they've done with New York earlier. So if the government can't give people jobs, the government or the legislative body can't meet to discuss problems unless the royal governor says they can. And they also passed a new quartering act, which was even more strict than the one that had been levied on New York before. And they required that landlords not only house British troops, but they also had to pay for their food. We're talking about a lot of money. And the reaction to that, there's several reactions. All over the colonies, people were aware of the travails of Boston, and they started feeling sorry for them, and they started sending food up to them overland. And the people up in New England, Boston, even from New York on up, and then down in Virginia, decided through their committees of correspondence that they needed all to get together. And you're going to have the meeting of the First Continental Congress take place on the 5th of September in 1774 in Philadelphia. There have been some previous meetings. They really didn't have a name for the meetings. Down in Williamsburg and other places. In September of 1774, they're sitting around. They're meeting in Philadelphia in Carpenter's Hall. 2 weeks into the meeting, a young man by the name of Paul Revere. He was a famous silversmith. In fact, there was a fictional story written about him when I was a youngster that kind of made me interested in history for the first time, called Johnny Tremaine. But he brings from the county of Suffolk in Massachusetts a list of suggestions for what the Continental Congress should do. They were written by Dr. Joseph Warren. We've heard about him before, we'll hear about him again. Suggesting that they make the decision to disobey the coercive acts. Suggesting that they refuse to pay taxes to the royal government. Suggesting that they reorganize or they organize their militias. Elect officers. Start practicing what they call the arts of war. There's no word about independence. They're talking about resisting the taxes. They're talking about forcing the British government to change their mind. A group of these people, the big businessmen, formed something called the Continental Association during this time. The Continental Association was interested in trade and that sort of thing. And they're going to come up with the idea of massive boycotts of British products. So when the Continental Congress concludes on the 26th of October, they're going to issue several things. One, you might want to write this down, is the Declaration of American Rights. This is another one of those things. They're going to mail off to England. They're going to send to the other colonies, send out to the colonies. They also endorse those Suffolk resolves that Paul Revere brought in. They also institute a new policy, the one put forward by the Continental Association: boycott British goods. Don't buy things from England. Find substitutes. And they decide that if that doesn't work, the following year, what they're going to do is stop selling things to the British. So totally cutting off trade with Britain. It's interesting to look at that. That was the last result, because if they did that, then that meant that they cut off their own income. They didn't want to do that in a hurry. In February of 1775, at the beginning of the year, after mulling this over, Lord North...
Mr. Hunt, Coach, Health Center cannot see the slides.
There are no slides. Just my beautiful face.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Would you like to see a substitute for my face? I can get you one here in a minute. Maybe I'll wear a mask. Lord North, in February of 1775, sends out this kind of a note. He says it's to conciliate, to make up their differences. And here's what he suggests. He suggests that from now on, when the British tax American goods, American imports, the tax money will remain in the Americas. Sounds like a great thing, now they're not taking the tax away from the Americas. Of course, that tax money could be used to, for example, fund the British Army that's stationed in America and pay the expenses of British officials in America. Somewhere along the line, the British government takes over paying the royal governor's salary instead of having the colonies pay it. And the other part of this conciliatory resolution is that the colonies, since the British were letting the money stay in the Americas, would have to pay or contribute to the cost of their own defense. So maybe it wasn't such a deal after all. Patrick Henry down in Virginia urges his people to war in the House of Burgesses. He tells the people in the House of Burgesses, we can hear people doing military drills and all sorts of things up in New England. Why are we sitting around? He says, what is it the gentleman wish? He's talking to his fellow Burgesses. What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, and we all know what the rest of it is. Probably. But as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Now, the time before when he made a famous speech, and they said, that sounds treasonous, he kind of backed down and said, I'm sorry. He's not backing down anymore. So we're getting into military events, and I am going to turn on some slides and show you a map or two here. If I can get this old creature to work. The colonists up north are starting to store away things like lead, gunpowder, even some weapons. They're not bringing them into Boston or anything like that. They're storing them out on farms inland from Boston. In particular, out in the area of a small town in between, trying to think the two rivers. One of them is the Mystic River. I can't remember the other river. Hello, machine. What are you doing? It's not cooperating, whatever it's doing. There it is. They did some repairs to our system over the weekend. I hope they didn't really mess it up. We'll give it a try here. If the wonderful PowerPoint will ever come to life. Yeah, there's a pretty good map right there. I'll get it. People down here saying, Mr. Hunt, you haven't put it up on the screen yet. It's about to go on. That slide right there, hang on. There's the reaction of the Continental Congress to the Lord of the North's conciliatory resolution. There's our wonderful little city of Boston. That dark blob in the middle of the screen. Notice how Boston's not really on the mainland. It's almost an island except for a little causeway. Two ways to get onto the mainland. One is to get in a little ferry boat and go over to the Charleston Peninsula up north of Boston. The other way is to go on this little causeway that connects with the mainland to the south of Boston. If you look inland a little bit, see if you can see this map. It's not super clear for you guys. Look at it on your own slides there, the ultra slides. You can see that there's a road that leads all the way into a town called Lexington, and then beyond that to a town called Concord. And out behind Concord, on a farm, there's a pretty big storage site of weapons and ammunition, pretty carefully hidden away. And General Gage is not blind and dumb, nor is the government in England, and they know that the colonists are doing these things. And they tell General Gage to get off his butt and do something about it. He's not inclined to because he doesn't want to fan the flames. But he does it because he's ordered to, and he sends 700 British soldiers under a lieutenant colonel named Francis Smith to march all the way out there to Concord via Lexington, discover the arms supplies and destroy them, and come back to avoid engagements with anyone on the way, just to get out there and do his job and come back. When he gets as far as Lexington and he marches on the 19th of April, he discovers something strange. Although he was marching in the early morning before sun came up, it was dark, there was a unit of militiamen lined up outside the little town center in Lexington, which surprised him. How did they know I was coming? Then we go back to thinking about General Gage, who with his wife, Margaret Gage, was an American. He planned most of his military operations. The home he was living in was also his headquarters. So they were planned in his living room, I'm sure. His doctor was a fellow named Warren. And Dr. Warren was also a leading patriot. And Dr. Warren was Mrs. Gage's doctor too. And I guess you just have to add 2 and 2 together to figure out what happened, but somehow or another, the Americans knew all about it. There was a gunshot at Lexington, but there was no major engagement, and the militia faded away into the woods. So the British marched on, and they got to Concord. And Colonel Smith divided his troops, sent one small unit over to the north of town and went to the south of town searching for the weapons. The weapons were up north of town on a farm. They actually got to that farm. They searched the farm. They searched all the outbuildings, the barns, searched under the haystacks, searched the house. No guns, no weapons. So they turned around and had to cross a little bridge on the way back into town to join the rest of their force. And they were ambushed. And there were some British soldiers who went down, and there were some Americans that went down. Not a super large number, but there were casualties inflicted, and the young officer managed to maintain order and marched his troops on through and rejoined the main force. In the meantime, having heard gunshots, Colonel Smith's already sent a rider back to Boston saying, I think I'm going to need help. And the reaction of the commander in Boston was to send out 1,000 British soldiers. They're going to march to Lexington. Colonel Smith's going to meet up with them. Now it's a force of about 1,700 men. And the funny thing's happening as they march. More and more people start arriving out in the peripheries, out in the woods along their trail, starting to fire at them. It doesn't destroy the English unit. It doesn't inflict super casualties, but it inflicts a number of casualties, kills a number of soldiers. But they marched all the way back into Boston, and very quietly as they marched into Boston, they were followed by militia. The militia took up posts around the outskirts of Boston, The British could have always gone out and wiped out their posts, but then they would have found themselves in the middle of the continent with no support. So they sat there in Boston. Has the war begun yet? Well, the first gunshot in Lexington is called the shot heard around the world. But no. And the British government was more than willing to say this was an incident, this isn't a war. They're not really willing to accept that it's a war. But as far as the Americans were concerned, at least some of them, they believed it was a war. The Second Continental Congress is going to meet a month later. Lexington and Concord happened on the night of the 18th and morning of the 19th of April, 1775. In May of 1775, Second Continental Congress is coming into session. Some interesting things are going to happen. Now, one of the leaders in this group was George Washington. We've talked about him before. He certainly wasn't the foremost leader. He may have been the tallest one. He'd had some military experience, not of it particularly successful. Someone comes to George Washington, a young, very, very energetic, almost hyperactive young guy by the name of Benedict Arnold. One of the problems that the Americans would face if they were going to fight the British was they had no artillery. They had no cannons. Oh, they may have had a couple of cannons on ships or something, but they didn't have much. Benedict Arnold comes up with an idea. He knows where there's weapons. They're way up on the lake called Lake Champlain, which featured, let me switch slides. I'm going to go to first shots to Monmouth. You've got that also, if you want to follow along. And it kind of goes back and talks about Lexington and Concord. But it's got a map on it, a couple of maps, that show you Lake Champlain. On this map that I'm putting up on the screen right now, it looks pretty small. But if you combine that map, that lake with some of the rivers there, what you could do is go almost all the way from the St. Lawrence River all the way down to the Hudson River on water, which made it really, really fast to move forces. And on that lake during the French and Indian War, the British had built several forts. One of them was a fort called Ticonderoga, another was a fort called Crown Point. When the British pulled out, they did something kind of like our forces did in Afghanistan. They left the guns and weapons behind. In this case, though, they left just small forces to guard them. And Benedict Arnold told Mr. Washington, who wasn't a general quite yet, told him, if I took some men up there, I could take the guns away from those two forts and nobody could stop me. Another guy got the same idea. He was a Vermonter named Ethan Allen. He went to some of his friends in this gathering and said the same thing. And you end up having these two guys kind of fighting over who's going to be in charge. Moving all the way up to Lake Champlain to take the guns. On one day they captured Crown Point. The following day, or a day or so later, in May, they captured Ticonderoga. I think it's the other way around. They got Ticonderoga first. They're going to get cannons, howitzers. What's the difference between a cannon and a howitzer? Anybody know? Anybody got any idea what the difference is? Cannon is a muzzle loader. A howitzer you load from the breech, from the back end. It's a much more modern weapon, much more accurate. They're going to capture some of those. They're going to capture some mortars. And this is a weapon that fires an explosive round way up into the air, a very high trajectory, but it's incredibly accurate if you know your algebra or your calculus. And it's very easy because it'll go past things like fortress walls and all that, because it's going to go over them and then come back down. What happened to our signal? See if we can. There you go, we got it back. They're gonna get these guns, and the guns are gonna disappear, and you guys tell me when they reappear, because I'll ask you. About this time, a few weeks later, George Washington is going to be appointed to command all of the forces of the colonies. He doesn't have an army yet, but they're going to start appointing his immediate subordinates, some generals that will be under him. A lot of the appointees are political appointees. They got a lot of friends, so they get the job. Some of the young generals are very, very good. Some of them are totally useless. On the 17th of June, the British officers are outside, and General Gage was still in charge. They're outside early in the morning, and someone looks up north, up to the Charleston Peninsula, and notices there's people on top of a couple of hills over there, and they're looking down, and no military officer wants the bad guys or potential bad guys looking down at him. And General Gage tells a couple of his subordinates, including General Howe, General Clinton, perhaps General Cornwallis, I'm not sure, go do something about that. So they take about 2,200 British soldiers, and they go over and they land unopposed on Charleston Peninsula, look up the hill, and start marching up that hill to clear it off. And they're shocked to be driven off the hill by gunfire. So they reform at the bottom of the hill. The officers now are paying a little bit more attention. And the second time they go up the hill, and once again they're driven off the hill by gunfire. And they're suffering casualties. On the third attempt, the people on the top of the hill ran out of ammunition, were reduced to throwing rocks or whatever, and so a covering force stayed there, and the rest withdrew to the hill behind. Now, it's called the Battle of Bunker Hill, but the name of the hill was Breed's Hill. Once again, the historians got it wrong. Now, the next hill behind them was Bunker Hill, but there was not much of a fight on that hill, because when they went over off of Breed's Hill, they collected the guys that were on Bunker Hill, and they skedaddled back onto the mainland off of the Charleston Peninsula, leaving behind their rear guard that were to hold the British off to give them time to get away. There's a more schematic looking thing. You can see Breed's Hill there. That's a famous painting. Remember Dr. Joseph Warren? The guy that brought the news to them about Concord? Gage's doctor? Joseph Warren was made to be a general in the militia, and they told him, "You're in command of the force on Charleston," and he said, "I'm not qualified, I'm a doctor, for heaven's sakes, I'm not qualified to be a general." And there was another fellow there named Putnam, and he said, "Let him be the general, I'll fight as a private," which he did, and he stayed in the rear guard to hold the British off, and they were pretty angry after being driven off the hill 2 times, and they chopped him to pieces when they got to the top of the hill. Not only did they chop him to pieces, they stuck him in a shallow grave, and a couple of weeks later, some naval officer, they were still angry about this. The British were infuriated about Bunker Hill, even though they managed to clear the hill eventually. They dug up his body and desecrated his body. I don't know what that proves, but it made them feel better, I guess. Now it's a war. And we've got to talk about the results of that. But let's go at it, let's be a little bit more methodical so we can get through all of this. After that, they're going to get an idea that maybe the people in the northern colonies like Quebec, who happen to be French Catholics, who probably don't like the English, maybe they'd like to join in on this war against the English. So what they figure is, well, Quebec's under English control, but it's not a very big force. If we march soldiers up there, maybe the people of Quebec will rise up and support us. And so they made almost a superhuman march to get to Quebec. One of the leaders was a colonel named Montgomery, another was Benedict Arnold. And others, and they didn't succeed. Despite all the hardship they went through to get up there, they didn't succeed. And some of them were captured. But let's talk about the other results of Bunker Hill. As soon as the British government and the British Parliament found out about it, the majority of Parliament wants reprisal. They want to get even for this. Reprisal is kind of a nice way to say revenge. The king declares New England to be in rebellion in August. By October, he's going to say it's all the colonies, it's not just New England. The governor of Virginia, the royal governor of Virginia, has a brilliant idea, and he decides to tell all the slaves in Virginia, if you rise up against your masters, we will give you your freedom when the war is over. And although the uprising didn't work, I have to say that the British kept their word, and they transported maybe as many as 4,000 slaves off of North America at the end of the American Revolution. Some of them went back to Africa, some of them went to other locations. But that's yet in the future. Parliament's going to outlaw trade with the American colonies with something called the Prohibitory Act in December of 1775. No one may do business with the colonies, period. Anyone doing business with the colonies is subject to having their ships captured and declared prizes of war, which means you never get it back. Also, the king's a little bit unsettled. Why is he unsettled? Well, he's worried about if a major fight against all the colonies occurs. That's a big area. He's got quite a few soldiers that are free to fight, maybe as many as 50,000. But considering the area we're talking about, that spreads really thin. And he realizes instinctively something that they'll learn the hard way later on. It's probably impossible to do it with 50,000. So he goes over to his family's native Hanover, that part of Germany, and he recruits an army, as was the habit in European wars. He recruits an army of 30,000 more men to go over to Halifax to join the British forces. So that would up his forces, overall forces, up to about 80,000 or so. I want to tell you that's still not enough. If you spread 80,000 men over a giant area, such as the area they were fighting, it's pretty much an impossibility to win. Let's talk about it. Here's the commander-in-chief of all British forces on the land, General Howe. General Gage gets fired because he didn't do a very good job around Bunker Hill, so he's going to get fired. General Howe's going to take over. Senior to him is his brother, who's a Navy admiral, who will be in charge of everything, Navy, land, and all that in North America. Let's look at the American situation when this war starts. See if we can predict who's going to win. The Americans didn't really have an army. They had militia that was untrained, maybe as many as 16,000. They had an organized Navy. In order to have a Navy, there was a guy, you might want to write this guy's name down, we'll talk about him later too. His name is Robert Morris. And Robert Morris is the owner of over 100 ships. He's very wealthy. He does trade around the world. And he's going to start donating his ships to the Continental Congress to serve as a Navy. And he provides some crews as well, but they had no organized Navy. Political leadership, well, they had people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. Probably the most brilliant was Benjamin Franklin. But as far as military leadership was concerned, nobody was tested. George Washington had never won a battle. Every battle he'd been in, he lost. Their location was advantageous because they were fighting on their home ground, and whenever you're fighting on your home ground, you tend to fight better, and you have more support locally. But the problem with the colonies was that each colony had its own idea about how to solve problems, and so trying to keep all the colonies together was like herding cats. Weapons, they didn't have very many weapons. They had whatever people kept at home. There was one fellow down in Virginia who had a whole unit who were armed with rifles. A rifle was kind of a new weapon because rifles with rifle barrels that spin the bullet are much more accurate than muskets, which are smooth bore. And there's also those weapons that they got up at those two forts. Transportation, they didn't need to go anywhere far. They were defending at home. They could get food pretty easily. They didn't have much money. Time, if you talk about what the Americans needed to do, what did they need to do? Did they need to go over to England and conquer the British nation? Did they need to totally defeat the British Army? No. All they had to do was fight on and on until the British got tired of it. So time was on their side. As far as money was concerned, you had some rich individuals like Robert Morris, the fellow I mentioned before. Let's talk about him just for a sec. Robert Morris didn't use all his own money, but Robert Morris, during the American Revolution, collected something in the vicinity of $94 million. The entire Continental Congress, throughout the war, sum total of what they collected was about $800,000. So basically, Robert Morris financed the war. At first, though, they didn't have any money. The Continental Congress had no power to tax anyone or to raise money. Their strategy was pretty simple: survive. All they needed to do was fight to a stalemate, and eventually the British would get tired and go away. At least that's what they thought. On the British side, 50,000 experienced troops, 30,000 Hessians who were more or less professional soldiers. Their leadership, experience. Maybe they weren't the greatest leaders, but they were experienced. Their military was good, but some of their best military men were busy trying to put down rebellions in Ireland and do other things of that nature. I have to keep looking at my phone because the system's going up and down here. Transportation, the British had the greatest taxi cabs in the world. They had the Royal Navy. And of course, most of the colonies are along the coastline, so they can move their soldiers north-south really quickly. Whereas if you marched over land, there were no road systems. It took you a long time to get anywhere. Time's against them. Because the British were about to learn what we all know from every war, the wars in your lifetime, the wars in my lifetime, that sooner or later, if you've sent troops overseas, people at home are going to start howling to bring them back. People are going to start saying, we've sacrificed too much, come back, quick. So the British needed to get this war over before their own people started complaining about it. Remember, the merchants didn't like it because they were already losing money not trading with the Americans. As far as money was concerned, they were the world's richest nation. Money was not a problem. Their strategy was a problem. They only had one way to win. They had to totally dominate the Americans. Because if you dominated in one place and they popped up in the other place, for us slightly older people, there's a game called whack-a-mole that they have at bars and pubs. And basically that's what the British would have to do. Every time they whacked that mole on the head one place, it'd pop up somewhere else. And the only way they could win this war was to sit on all of the colonies, and there's no way 80,000 men could do that. Someone should have whispered in their ear, and I'm sure some people did. Stand up in Parliament and say, there's no way we can come out ahead of this. It's a lose-lose situation. But the war already had inertia, and it was going to keep on going. early in 1776. You start seeing another phase of the war. By this time, Congress has set up a Navy, a Marine Corps. They've got all these militias joining into what they call the Continental Army. They call them Continentals for short. They started trying to negotiate with the Indians to keep from having trouble with them. The Indians tended to be loyal to the British. Political warfare breaks out. And a very, very famous piece of writing is done by a fellow by the name of Thomas Paine. You want to write that name down? And write the name of what he wrote. It's called Common Sense. He published it anonymously in January of 1776. This is probably the first time in America anyone dared to put in print the argument that the American colonies should be separated from Britain. On the face of it, it was total treason. So it's a dangerous thing to write in print. But his argument, and you can look at it if you want, it's in the written notes, his argument was that it was ridiculous for an island nation to try and rule an entire continent. And he also pointed out that the people in the American colonies weren't all English. There were Germans and Swiss and all sorts of people. So it was kind of a long stretch for the English to say, we own that. And he went on and on, saying that they're so far away that they can't take care of the colonies. And they'd already proven that. And he concluded that England was ruling the American colonies for the profit of England, and they didn't take into consideration the welfare of the people in the American colonies. We're getting into a real war. There's Charleston, again, Charleston Peninsula, Boston. Okay, we'll talk about that in just a sec. Continental Congress is still in session, and they will remain in session until the end of the war. They set up a committee early in the year to draft an official declaration of their political point of view and what we're fighting for. We'll call it eventually the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Robert Livingston of New York, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and of course Benjamin Franklin are going to be involved in writing this. We usually give Thomas Jefferson the credit for writing the most of it, and in part it's kind of a copy of the ideas put forth in a declaration that the state of the province of Virginia has already issued. He wrote that too. Benjamin Franklin tweaked it up a little bit. He was probably the smartest man in the group. Somewhere along that time, they're also going to decide that they need to figure out some rules under which they'll operate. And they asked John Dickinson, the guy, by the way, who's still not sure, are we supposed to be declaring independence? Not everybody was thinking about independence until this stage of the game. But they're going to task him with coming up kind of bylaws under which the Continental Congress will run, and they call those bylaws the Articles of Confederation. Okay, let's talk about Boston again. So, General Howe and General Clinton and General Cornwallis and General Burgoyne and all their friends are kind of bottled up in Boston. Oh, and a lot of their troops are on ships in Boston Harbor. You remember the Charleston event, the Bunker Hill story? This time it's to the south. There's a really, really high ridge line that runs along a peninsula south of Boston, also looking down, if at all possible, even from a greater height. And they look out at that ridge line one fine morning, in fact, the 4th of March, 1776. And on top of that hill, they find, what did they find, guys? Told you I was going to ask you about this. But they find up on that hill, pointed down at them in Boston. Good morning. Anybody? What did they find up on that hill? I told you they were disappearing and they were gonna reappear. See, their mind's already gone blank. What disappeared? How about the guns from Crown Point and Ticonderoga? They are now on the top of Dorchester Heights, pointed down at Boston. A very, very clever man by the name of Henry Knox managed to smuggle them all the way from Lake Champlain, under the nose of the British, all the way down to Dorchester Heights. At night, they put them up on the top of the heights. They tied stuff around the wheels of the gun carriages so they wouldn't make a lot of noise. And they got up there undetected. Now, General Howe has a choice. One of his choices is to attack that hill and take the guns. But of course, they learned caution where? They learned caution at Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill about attacking Americans up on top of hills. The other choice he had was get out from under those guns. And that's what he chose to do. And so the British forces in Boston are going to load up on ships. They'll load as many of their loyal colonists up on ships. And they're going to leave. Is the war over? Oh no. The war has just begun. But they're going to go up to Halifax, Nova Scotia. They're going to meet with reinforcements. They're going to meet with the Hessians that we were talking about. They're coming back. But maybe not to Boston. Boston doesn't seem to be a real friendly place. We'll pick up next time, according to my fine watch, which works better than the system clock. We'll pick up next time, and we'll finish off this war. Take a look at the keywords, bring them in. If you've got questions during class, you can ask them anytime you want, or you can send me messages. I've started getting some messages. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. You do the same.
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes. Your conference is now over. Goodbye.